Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I am going to be doing a final wrap-up of the books that I read in May. So I did have a mid-month wrap-up in which I think I had finished 7 books, if my count is correct, if I'm remembering correctly. I think I finished 4 books in the last half of the month, but I also had quite a few books that I ended up DNFing. I feel like May was the month of DNFs, which I kind of feel bad about because I don't generally DNF that many books. And in fact, I think I had DNF'd maybe 4 books the whole year, 3 or 4 books. And then in May, I DNF'd 5, which is a lot. Part of the reasoning for that is that it was what I was calling mood reading May. And so if I was really hating a book, I was just like, you know what, I'm not going to finish it. And then part of it was just some of the books that I was reading, I might have DNF'd anyway. So I'm going to start by talking about the DNFs. I might have mentioned some of these in previous videos. I don't think that I did, but fair warning. So the main book that I want to talk about that I did DNF was Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. I was a co-host of a read-along for this, and that makes it seem even worse that I DNF'd it. I did get like halfway through the book before I DNF'd it, and I felt a little bit better because every single one of the co-hosts actually DNF'd this book long before I did, so I felt like I definitely stuck in there. Basically, it came down to the point where I was about to leave on vacation and I wanted to read something I enjoyed reading on vacation, and this wasn't it. I was just like, I am dreading every time I have to pick up this book and everyone else is done, so I think I'm done too. And out of our group that read it, we had a whole bunch of people who were super excited to start with us, and I think only 2 or 3 people actually finished it. So that makes me feel like maybe it was more the book than it was me, but maybe I will try this book again in the future. I don't know. I'm not planning on unhauling this book as of this moment, but I'm not sure when I will want to pick it up again. So my issues with this book were numerous, honestly. I really struggled with how Pasternak wrote his characters. That was my ultimate struggle with this, is that I felt like all of the characters were very surface level and you didn't really get to know them all that well, but yet you were expected to care about them. The story itself was pretty disjointed, where we would have these massive time jumps that would just happen where all of a sudden we are 5 years in the future and the main character has gotten married and had a child, but we didn't see the wedding, we didn't see the proposal, we didn't see any of those things. I still felt like Pasternak would tell us more than he would show us things. So he would say, hey, this big argument happened in one sentence and this is how they felt about it, but like it didn't really go into any details. It didn't show us the scene at all, and so that made it really frustrating to read, and it made it not very rewarding to read. I've heard this book billed as like this epic romance, and it's not. It's really not. Zhivago is a jerk and treats all the women in his life terribly. He's a really bad husband, and he's just not a very nice guy. So ultimately, I think not having characters that I liked or felt attached to was a huge reason why I wasn't enjoying this book. Although I do feel like if the book had been written from the perspective of Laura rather than from the perspective of Zhivago, I might have enjoyed it more, because the beginning, like first section, I really felt for Laura and basically her upbringing and how her life was. I felt really bad for her. But from then she just fades into the background and seems to merely just be a plot device rather than actually like a full-fleshed character that we're looking into. So it's hard for me to say whether or not my issue with the book was truly the book, or perhaps it just doesn't translate all that well into English. I did try a couple of translations for this. This was the best translation out of all of them. This is the Hayward and Harari translation, which was the original translation into English. But I did check out the Pavir and Volokhonsky translation as well, and that one was honestly awful. It was horrible. It was very choppy and broken up and really difficult to read. This was much easier to read, but it's just still, the story just wasn't very engaging. So I kind of wonder sometimes whether or not things were lost in translation that maybe made it more difficult for me to read. I'm not really sure, but yeah, did not finish this one. Another book that I can't find anywhere for some reason that I DNF'd is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison. I was buddy reading this with Christy Lewis from Dostoevsky in Space and Victoria from A Musical Bookworm. This was originally supposed to be something we were going to read for Lent, and then we just kind of didn't, and then we ended up picking it up a little later, and this book was unfortunately very boring. Which makes me really, really sad. The edition that I have says that it is greatly expanded and updated. And I think that that's unfortunate because it's so expansive that we have really very meaningless letters. There are parts of the letters that are really beautiful sentiments and statements of faith as Bonhoeffer is in prison. But then there's these letters where the only thing in the letter is, hey, I would like this book. Could you send me some cigarettes? Also, I really need an extra suit of clothes. And then the next letter is something like, I don't know why you can't find that suit of clothes because I really need it and I know exactly where I left it and it's really odd that you can't find it. And stuff like that. It was just very trivial and I don't feel like it needed to be there. I felt like the letters could have been greatly condensed as to what they were, because I think the book that I have, the edition, is in like the 300 to 400 page range and it's very long, and a lot of the stuff is just difficult to read because it's not interesting in any way. I also know that Bonhoeffer's religious views kind of took a nosedive towards the end of his life, where he was really grappling with some things and saying he believes some things that are very antithetical to the principal tenets of the Christian faith, but I never got to that point. So I don't know. I also know that, he never fully fleshed out this new theology that he was exploring and thinking about, that had his life been prolonged, maybe he wouldn't have been making the conclusions that he was. So I'm not really sure about any of that. I didn't even get that far. I think I got maybe 75 pages into it and just couldn't anymore. It wasn't, the whole point of me reading the book was for it to be spiritually uplifting. And it wasn't at all. It was just really kind of dull, unfortunately. So in my last video, I know I mentioned Life of Pi by Jan Martel and how I was probably going to DNF this because every time I tried to read it, I would fall asleep. I decided that I'm temporarily DNFing it. I actually would like to get back to it, but I don't know if it's going to be like in the near future. It's for sure not going to be in June. It may be at some other point in the summer, maybe later in the year, maybe next year. I don't know, but for right now, I do want to hang on to it and kind of give it another chance, but I just don't, it's just not working for me right now. And the last book that I DNF'd was actually one that I was supposed to read in June, but I started it a little bit early because I had a whole bunch of books that I was reading really rapidly in the days after I got back from vacation. And I had just kind of run out of books to read for the month. So I decided I was going to pick this one up because it sounded really good and sounded like maybe something I would be in the mood for. And that's These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. So this is a YA set in 1920s Shanghai. It's supposed to be a Romeo and Juliet retelling. So there's like these two gangs in Shanghai. One is a group of Chinese people and then the other one is a group of Russians, and they're fighting against each other. And when we pick up at the beginning of the book, the Romeo and Juliet characters, who I think are Roma and Juliet, they have already had some sort of relationship and some sort of falling out. So they're like enemies to lovers to enemies again, and now essentially probably lovers at some point. There's also this weird thing that's happening where I don't know if it's supposed to be a virus or if it's supposed to be some sort of fantastical element. I can't really tell, where it's causing these people to just randomly like rip their own throats out. And honestly, those scenes were really gross and a bit much for me. So that was part of the reason that I wasn't enjoying it. Also, I found most of the characterization to be very bland, but Juliet was straight up annoying. And when one of the main characters is just like an entitled brat, it just makes you want to slap them. Also, this book does something a little bit strange. I think it's trying to tackle some colonization things that happened in Shanghai, which I actually wasn't even aware of, that in Shanghai in come the Russians and the French and the British, and they're all kind of just taking over Shanghai and kind of pushing a lot of the Chinese things out. And that really did happen, which I wasn't aware of. So that was pretty interesting. But the weird thing is that in this book, the French and the British are the ones who are kind of attacked for colonization, but the Russians are not included in that at all. And I think it's probably because Roma's the love interest, but it seems really weird to be like, well, here come these colonizers and these poor oppressed Russians in the city that they're also trying to overtake and push the Chinese out, but they're poor and they're oppressed. It's a shame what's happening to them and the Chinese. And I was just like, that's weird because the Russians are trying to colonize as well. So it was just kind of strange. And I think that the reason it was like that is because the love interest was Russian. So he kind of got a free pass, I guess. But it was just, the setup was just really weird. I didn't like the writing and I didn't really like the main characters. And then it started getting very, very gory and detailed and how people were clawing their throats out. And I was just like, you know what? I don't think that this is for me. I got about 125 pages in and then was just like, I don't think so. I think there are other books that I would rather read and I can return this to the library and someone else can enjoy it. Okay, now let's talk about the books that I did finish. So the first book that I finished is one of the books that I brought on vacation with me, and I brought several books with me, and this is the only book I ended up reading, and that's The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. I started this book in February for Feb Regency and was really enjoying it. I think I got either a quarter or a third of the way through, but then middle grade March happened and then other things happened and I had all these reading commitments, so I just kind of set it down and always wanted to pick it back up. And I have been thinking about it for all of May, like, man, I really want to read that. And then I realized, wait a second, it's Mood Reading May. Why am I trying to finish these other books that I'm not enjoying at all and actually pick up a book I really want to read? And I'm really happy that I did that. I ended up giving this book 5 stars. I loved every second of reading this book. This book was very heavily referenced in Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, which I read last summer. And ever since I finished that book, I really, really wanted to read The Mysteries of Udolpho. So it follows this young girl, Emily, and she has like 2 very, very loving parents, and then her mother gets sick and passes away at the beginning of the book. Her and her father travel all around, and there's just some really, really gorgeous travel descriptions and nature and all these things. It's just amazing. I just thought the writing was beautiful. So they stumble into a young man on their journeys, and Emily and this young man, Valancourt, end up falling in love, and then more tragedy ensues, and Emily ends up being taken away from her home and living with someone who is very unkind to her, and then ends up in this castle called Udolpho. That doesn't even happen until about a third of the way through the book or something. We're past the 200-page mark, I think, by the time she finally makes it to the castle. So up to this point, the story has been very slow, very meandering, lots of beautiful nature descriptions, lots of wisdom imparted by her father, and it was a very slow read, but I was really enjoying it. At the point where she finally ends up in the castle, the rest of the book is a much faster pace and has a lot of creepiness to it, a lot of weirdness to it, a lot of like, what is going on here? And I liked how all the plot lines were resolved and really enjoyed that part of the book as well. And I loved the main character especially. Emily is put in so many very, very difficult situations, and I loved her perseverance and her strength throughout that. I mean, true, she does faint a lot, but this is the time period where anything startling happens and everyone faints. It was just a thing back then, which is really weird because that never happens nowadays. So I don't understand. But that's okay. So anyways, she has lots of perseverance, a great strength of character, but yet she never loses her kindness and her compassion for others, even people who are mistreating her. I just loved her fortitude and her moral character, and just loved her and connected very deeply with her as a character. So yes, I love this book so much, and I'm so happy that I picked it up again and was able to finish it. My other vacation read was a reread, and it's one that I actually listened to the audiobook for with my family as we were road tripping. I'm not really much of an audiobook person most of the time, but I love them on long road trips, and we drove about 15 hours, so that it really helps the time to go by faster. So that book is The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. So I read The Hobbit to my daughter a few years ago, and we started The Fellowship of the Ring, but it was just a bit much and she just wasn't quite ready for it. So this year I decided on my Classics TBR that I wanted to reread the entirety of The Lord of the Rings, and I had read them many times before. I think the first time I read them in their entirety was when I was 12, and then I read them every single year, the entire trilogy, pretty close right up until I think my daughter was born, and then I haven't read them since. My daughter will be 10 this year, so that tells you. It's been a while since I've read them. And this was just as wonderful and amazing as the first time I read it, and I just really enjoyed it. My husband had never read it, and so he really enjoyed it because he loved the movies, and I did too, and so he had never read the books, so seeing the difference between the books and the movies was really interesting. And it was funny because right after we came home from vacation, we watched The Fellowship of the Ring, and both Peter and I were like, wow, like not only is this different in some ways, but we were just surprised at how fast the movie seemed compared to the book, where it's just like everything's moving along so quickly, and in the book that's definitely not the case. And I think that was probably a wise decision on the part of Peter Jackson, that we don't just randomly have 19 years in between, like when Bilbo disappears and then when Frodo takes off with the ring. There's not like this big long time gap in, so I think that was probably a good thing. But anyways, we really enjoyed listening to the audiobook for this. I think we listened to it on Spotify, actually. So thank you to Penny from Cat Lady Book Nook, because she recommended it to me, finding it on Spotify. And the edition that we listened to is actually like a podcast, and I think it's called An Unexpected Journey. But it was amazing. Like there was like different voices for different characters, and they actually had music from the movie in the background of some of the scenes, and they had sound effects in it, and it was just really well done, and we really enjoyed it. So then when I came back from vacation, I ended up finishing a couple more books before the end of the month. And these are both newer books, and I think that that's part of the reason why I finished them so quickly, is because they were just really fast reads. One of those was I Must Betray You by Ruta Sepetys. This is one that I really had been looking forward to reading, because it is set in communist Romania in the 1980s, and then kind of the downfall of communism during that time. So it follows a young boy, I think his name's Christian, and he's pulled aside by the secret police and asked to inform on his mother's employer, who is an American. And so he's asked to kind of befriend this American son who's around the same age as him, and if he will meet with the secret police and give them information, then they will give medication to his grandfather who's dying. This was really fast-paced and really good. I really liked the storyline in general. It is a YA, so there's a little bit of like tropey romance in there, but I didn't find it like cheesy or anything like that. My main complaint with this book is that I felt like there wasn't a lot of character development. I didn't feel like super attached to anyone in the book. So when things would happen that were shocking or horrible or devastating, I didn't cry. As opposed to Between Shades of Grey by Ruta Sepetys, that book made me cry multiple times. So good, felt so attached to the main character. And I just didn't have that here, but I still felt like it was just a really amazing book, and I still loved reading it so much and do highly recommend it. I thought it was really informative for the time period. There's lots of pictures and stuff in the back, and an author's note that explains a whole bunch of historical context. And I also thought it was cool. Last summer I read Tortured for Christ by Richard Wurmbrand, and he lived in communist Romania during the time period that this dictator was in power. And he's actually mentioned in this book. It's not explained like who he is, but at one point the main character is in like a prison that Richard Wurmbrand was in also, and so his name is like written on the wall and stuff. And so I thought that was really cool because I knew exactly who that was, even though there are probably lots of people who read this book who have never heard of Richard Wurmbrand. But I just thought that was a really cool connection as well. So I think I ended up giving this book 4 stars because it definitely like wasn't perfect, but it was still just a really great book. And then the last book that I ended up completing during May was The Silent Patients. And this is a thriller. My husband actually had been reading this. I got it from a little free library last year, and he had been reading it, and he's a pretty slow reader, and he'd been working on it for a few weeks. He was about halfway through, and then he had the day off, and so he finished the last half of the book in the afternoon, which was really fast reading for him. And he comes into me and he's like, I don't know what you're reading right now, but you need to put it down and you got to read this book because I really need to talk about it. The twist was like so crazy and you'll never see it coming. So I picked up the book and read it in the second half of the afternoon. I read it really quickly and really, really enjoyed it. So this book is basically about this woman who kills her husband. She seems like she has this perfect life and everything's wonderful and she seems happy, and she kills her husband and the police come in and she won't say a word and she hasn't spoken since she killed her husband. And our main character, our narrator, is a guy who is a psychotherapist, and he ends up getting a job at the place where she is. It's some sort of like high security mental facility, and he gets a job there and becomes her therapist. And so it's just a journey with all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of personal information about the narrator, the psychotherapist. There's a lot of his background story and all of that kind of stuff too. So we're very much in his head. Interspersed throughout the book are also journal entries from this girl who has killed her husband. So it kind of switches up just a little bit. I did think that this was a really good twist in this book, and I really enjoyed that aspect, but there were elements of it that caused me to completely like suspend my disbelief in order to enjoy it, where I was like, wait, but what about this? And why was this person portrayed this way? And wouldn't the police have noticed this? And I was like, you know what? I need to just like let it go so I can enjoy it. So I ended up giving it 4 stars because there were some things that I was just like, well, but yeah, I did really enjoy it. I will give you a heads up for those of you who are kind of picky about content in your books. There's obviously some violence in this book, and there's a decent amount of language. So if that bothers you, then just know that going in. But I still thought it was a really fun read and really enjoyed it. Well, those are the books that I read in the second half of the month. And honestly, the second half of the month was amazing. Like the books that I finished, I had 2 5 stars and 2 4 stars. So I feel like the second half of the reading month was really, really good. Way better than the first half of the month, even though there was a couple of DNFs in there. I'd love to hear from you down in the comments below. What was your reading month like? What was your favorite book that you read? I would love to hear that because I'm always looking for book recommendations, as if I don't already have a mile-long TBR. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.